Florence, 1633, lay shrouded in a chilling silence, a city where shadows whispered secrets of brutality and tragedy. Father Lorenzo de Rossi, a priest bound by faith, became both revered and feared, for his confessional booth concealed not solace, but the darkest confessions of mankind. The city murmured of vanished innocence, bloodshed, and cursed acts that clung to the walls like poison. Each penitent brought tales of murder, torture, and execution, voices trembling with the weight of human sin and the tragic reality that no man could escape. Father Lorenzo listened, his heart growing heavier with every revelation, each story leaving an invisible scar upon his soul. Cobblestone streets echoed with whispered rumors of his haunted presence, shadows of the macabre following him through alleys where betrayal and death had once walked. Families shivered, children hid their eyes, and even the clergy regarded him with awe and fear, understanding that the weight he carried was beyond mortal comprehension. Inside the church, the air thickened with cursed secrets, poisoned intentions, and the tragic cries of victims whose fates were cruelly sealed. Bloodshed and torture were no longer abstract concepts. They became tangible, intertwined with the priest's existence, forming a tapestry of brutality that he could neither escape nor unhear. The city's plague and political unrest amplified the horror, each confession echoing with execution, betrayal, and the suffering of innocents long forgotten. Shadows whispered along stone corridors, recounting tales of cults long vanished and macabre rituals concealed beneath the surface of pious devotion. Father Lorenzo walked fog-laden streets at night, pursued not by men but by the weight of the cursed and the condemned, a living testament to the human capacity for evil. Execution, vanished innocence, and brutal betrayal became inseparable from his reality, each confession layering upon the last, forging a life intertwined with tragedy. Florence, a city of devotion and art, had transformed into a haunted landscape, and Father Lorenzo, bound by faith, stood at its darkest center. Candle-lit chapels and echoing stone halls became theaters for bloodshed, torture, and macabre revelations, isolating him further from the world. The priest's sunken eyes reflected sleepless nights, visions of the vanished, the poisoned, and the condemned, each confession bridging the sacred and the infernal. The cursed nature of his vocation became apparent as he grew inseparable from the horrors he endured. A tragic figure whose life bore witness to murder, bloodshed, and forgotten secrets. Haunted by relentless confessions, he remained alone, a vessel for the cursed, the tragic, and the brutal, while Florence itself seemed complicit in preserving these macabre tales. Shadows clung to him, the weight of execution and torture ever present, a reminder of vanishing innocence and poisoned intentions. Every whispered secret reinforced the priest's tragic isolation, ensuring no story would be forgotten, no victim left unremembered, and no confession unheeded. Cursed, haunted, and condemned, Father Lorenzo de Rossi became both witness and victim, trapped in the unforgiving narrative of Florence, a living embodiment of bloodshed, brutality, and the macabre, forever entwined with the vanished and the tragic. Father Lorenzo's nights were filled with relentless burdens, each confession heavier than the last, weaving a web of bloodshed, tragedy, and cursed revelations that threatened to consume him. The city's fog-laden streets mirrored the darkness he carried within, every shadow a reminder of vanished victims, poisoned hearts, and brutal deeds. Villagers avoided the church after dusk, sensing the oppressive weight in the air, while even the clergy feared the confessional, aware that the priest bore the macabre realities of murder, execution, and tortured souls. Each confession became a living entity, etched with the anguish of the condemned, the cursed, and the forgotten, pressing upon his mind with relentless force. Shadows clung to him, whispering of brutal deeds and vanished innocence whose cries echoed endlessly within the confines of his thoughts. Night after night, he wandered the dimly lit corridors of the church, haunted by visions of cults long vanished, the poisoned, and the condemned. While Florence itself seemed to conspire with the horrors, embedding tragedy and bloodshed into the very stones of the city, execution, torture, and vanished innocence became inseparable from his existence, shaping a reality where salvation and damnation intertwined, inseparable and inescapable. The macabre and the brutal were no longer abstract tales. They existed in whispered secrets, trembling voices, and shadows that followed him through fog-laden alleys. Even moments of solitude offered no reprieve, as the cursed and haunted details of human depravity persisted, poisoning the night and saturating the air with tragedy. Each confession built upon the last, a relentless tide of bloodshed, betrayal, and vanished victims that refused to be forgotten. Father Lorenzo's body weakened under the unyielding pressure, yet his devotion compelled him onward, carrying the stories of the condemned, the cursed, and the tragic without pause. The city's dark history merged seamlessly with the confessions, a continuous cycle in which murder, macabre secrets, and execution intersected, leaving the priest trapped in an unending nightmare. Bloodshed, tortured souls, and vanished innocents became constant companions, echoing through corridors and alleys, reminding him that every confession carried weight and consequence. Shadows whispered of tragic deeds, poisoned intentions, and cults whose existence had been erased from memory, yet persisted in the confessional's dark grip. The relentless burden left him haunted, a solitary figure entwined with the vanished, the brutal, and the forgotten, walking a city whose fog and silence mirrored the sorrow he carried. Victims and executioners alike haunted his nights, their cries and confessions indistinguishable, blurring the line between earthly sin and infernal torment. Father Lorenzo became both witness and participant, a vessel for horrors that no man should endure, his life defined by the tragic, cursed, and macabre realities he absorbed. Florence itself seemed alive with these horrors, each stone, alley, and chapel saturated with bloodshed, brutality, and vanished innocence, a city whose darkness had claimed him as both observer and victim. The priest, condemned and haunted, continued his sacred duty amidst relentless terror, each confession forging deeper into the tragic fabric of his existence, leaving him inseparable from the cursed, the brutal, and the forgotten. The year was 1633, and Florence stood as a city of contradictions, beauty and art shadowed by political unrest and hidden brutality. Father Lorenzo de Rossi had been a devout priest, known for his unwavering faith, yet his destiny would entwine him with horrors beyond human comprehension. Born into a family of modest means, he had ascended through the church with piety and diligence, unaware that his life would soon intersect with the darkest elements of human nature. The city, renowned for its art and culture, concealed macabre secrets behind its ornate facades, and Lorenzo became both witness and unwilling participant. Citizens whispered of vanished innocents and murdered victims, tales that seemed too brutal to be real, yet too persistent to ignore. The confessional booth became a chamber where tragedy, torture, and cursed revelations converged, forcing the priest to bear the weight of humanity's darkest deeds. Execution, bloodshed, and betrayal were no longer distant events. They were tangible realities that shaped his existence. Florence itself seemed haunted, every alley, every stone imbued with the legacy of the vanished and the condemned. A city where cursed intentions and macabre acts lingered like poison in the air. Lorenzo's role required him to confront these horrors directly, each confession a window into a brutal world of murder, cult activity, and tragic fates. The clergy recognized the danger but could not intervene, leaving him isolated with the cursed knowledge he absorbed daily. Each day brought more victims, more tales of torture, and more evidence that evil thrived even amidst devotion. Families avoided his path, aware that the priest carried the weight of the condemned and the haunted. He walked through Florence with caution, understanding that his very presence was intertwined with the macabre and the tragic, a reflection of the cursed realities he could neither ignore nor escape. Cults long vanished were spoken of in whispers, their rituals steeped in bloodshed, and the priest alone held the memories of their actions, bound by duty, yet haunted by visions that invaded his dreams. Poisoned hearts and brutal betrayals revealed themselves in the confessions of the faithful, and each story reinforced the tragic burden that Lorenzo bore. The city's political unrest and the pervasive fear of plague amplified the horrors, creating a society where trust was fragile and murder could lurk behind any facade of piety. Execution became a recurring theme, a constant reminder that human life was fragile and innocence could vanish without warning. Victims of both man and circumstance appeared in the priest's confessional, their tales of brutality merging into a tapestry of tragedy that shaped Lorenzo's understanding of human depravity. The macabre and cursed nature of Florence forced him to confront truths that others ignored or forgot, each revelation leaving him more isolated, more haunted. Shadows of tortured souls and vanished innocence seemed to follow him through the city, blending the sacred and the infernal in ways that defied comprehension. Bloodshed, betrayal, and tragedy became inseparable from his daily life, his devotion tested by the relentless exposure to human cruelty. Father Lorenzo de Rossi, once a symbol of faith, now embodied the tragic, the cursed, and the brutal realities of a city steeped in history. A man condemned to carry the stories of the forgotten, the haunted, and the macabre, unable to release what he had learned or unhear the confessions that marked him forever. Father Lorenzo's immersion in the confessional exposed him to the deepest darkness of Florence, a city whose beauty masked the cursed and the brutal. Each day brought new victims, new tales of vanished innocence, poisoned intentions, and bloodshed that had been concealed behind pious facades. The priest became a living repository of tragedy, a man forced to witness horrors that defied comprehension, his soul marked by the macabre realities of human sin. The city's political turmoil, coupled with the lingering shadow of plague, created an environment where execution and murder were ever present, and trust was fragile among neighbors. Lorenzo's knowledge of cults long vanished, and secret rituals steeped in torture amplified the haunted aura surrounding him, leaving the priest isolated even among his peers. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of shadows that followed him, of cursed omens and tragedies that seemed to attach themselves to his very presence, reinforcing the notion that he was both witness and victim of Florence's darkest truths. Each confession carried the weight of human depravity, revealing brutal betrayals, poisoned hearts, and macabre acts that had long been forgotten by the living. The confessional became a chamber where the sacred intersected with the infernal, and Father Lorenzo bore the burden alone, condemned to absorb the stories of the cursed and the tragic. Execution, torture, and bloodshed were not distant events, but vivid realities that pressed upon his psyche, leaving him haunted during both day and night. The city itself seemed to conspire with these horrors, each alley and corridor echoing with whispers of vanished victims and brutal deeds that had been concealed for decades. Families avoided him, sensing the presence of death and tragedy that seemed to accompany the priest, while even the clergy treated him with awe and fear. Understanding that his duty had made him inseparable from the macabre, the weight of these confessions reshaped his life, blurring the line between observer and participant, sacred duty and cursed fate. Florence's history of political intrigue, cults, and unspeakable brutality provided a continuous stream of confessions filled with murder, bloodshed, and tragic outcomes. Father Lorenzo's eyes reflected sleepless nights spent contemplating the poisoned intentions and vanished innocents whose lives had been entwined with horror. The priest navigated a city that seemed haunted by its own past, every corner saturated with the echo of the condemned, the brutal, and the forgotten. Tales of betrayal, execution, and macabre acts formed a tapestry of cursed history, woven into the very streets he walked daily, leaving him both witness and prisoner of these tragedies. The confessional became a crucible of human depravity, forcing Lorenzo to reconcile his faith with the relentless exposure to murder, bloodshed, and cursed secrets. Each confession reinforced the tragic reality that Florence's surface beauty concealed a world steeped in brutality, vanished innocence, and tortured souls. Father Lorenzo de Rossi, bound by duty and faith, bore these burdens without relief, condemned to carry the stories of the cursed, the haunted, and the macabre, forever entwined with the bloodshed and tragedy that defined the city's darkest heart. Rumors began circulating through Florence long before the horrors fully revealed themselves. Whispers of cursed deeds and vanished innocence that clung to every alley like a shadow. Father Lorenzo de Rossi, already burdened by confessions of murder and bloodshed, found himself drawn into a web of suspicion and fear that the city could not escape. Tales spread of macabre rituals conducted in secret, poisoned hearts within noble families, and cults long vanished yet leaving traces of brutality behind. Citizens spoke in hushed tones of strange figures seen at night, disappearing as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the echoes of their actions and a lingering sense of dread. Lorenzo's confessional became the nexus of these growing tensions, a chamber where whispers of execution, torture, and cursed acts converged, each confession layering more tragedy onto his weary soul. The priest began noticing patterns in the stories, a convergence of vanished innocence, brutal murders, and poisoned intentions that pointed to a hidden network of evil operating beneath Florence's ornate surface. Shadows seemed to linger longer in the streets, twisting in unnatural ways, as if the city itself had become aware of the cursed events that unfolded within its walls. Children reported seeing figures that disappeared, macabre shapes that vanished before any adult could witness them, and every report fed the priest's growing unease. Political intrigue compounded the fear, as nobles and clergy alike whispered about murders that were never investigated, and bodies that disappeared, leaving only cursed symbols etched into stone. Each confession Lorenzo heard became a thread connecting these terrifying elements, revealing a pattern of bloodshed, torture, and tragic betrayal that the city could not escape. The air in Florence grew heavy with fear, each citizen acutely aware that something sinister had taken root, a cursed presence that seemed inseparable from the city itself. Rumors of secret executions and vanished victims circulated alongside tales of cults whose practices had been condemned, yet left an indelible mark on the people and streets. Lorenzo began to feel the cumulative weight of these revelations, the macabre nature of the confessions intertwining with the tragic history of Florence, making him a solitary witness to horrors that no mortal should endure. Every night he observed signs of the cursed influence, from shadows that moved unnaturally to faint whispers that carried through empty corridors. Each observation reinforced the grim reality that bloodshed, vanished innocence, and poisoned intentions were more than stories. They were living forces within the city. The priest's awareness heightened as he pieced together events that others dismissed, seeing connections between the cursed, the brutal, and the tragic that had remained hidden until now. Florence's art and beauty could not conceal the macabre undercurrent, the execution of innocence and the brutal betrayal of trust permeating its streets. Every confession, every whispered tale, built a network of horror, threading together murder, torture, and vanished victims into a tapestry of fear that Lorenzo could neither ignore nor release. Shadows seemed to follow him beyond the confessional, reminders of the cursed and tragic realities he carried. While the city itself appeared complicit in amplifying the macabre, each stone and alley imbued with the weight of bloodshed, Lorenzo understood that these rumors were only the beginning, a build-up to a climax of horror that would test his faith and sanity beyond measure. The tension in Florence escalated as Father Lorenzo continued to absorb the confessions, each revealing more brutal truths, vanished innocence and cursed deeds than the last. Stories of murder intertwined with whispered accounts of torture, bloodshed, and poisoned intentions, leaving the priest haunted day and night. Citizens grew wary, sensing the presence of tragedy and the macabre in their midst, their own whispers amplifying the cursed atmosphere that seemed inseparable from the city itself. Even the clergy avoided unnecessary visits to the church, aware that Lorenzo's confessional had become a chamber where the macabre and the brutal were drawn together like magnets, leaving no one untouched by the weight of the cursed. The rumors of cults long vanished persisted, their influence lingering through symbols etched into stone and tales of execution that had been concealed for decades. Lorenzo began to notice the convergence of these elements, the vanished victims, the poisoned hearts, and the bloodshed, forming a network of horror that threatened to engulf not only the city, but his very soul. Shadows appeared to stretch unnaturally across the streets and alleyways, moving with an intelligence that suggested the cursed presence knew he was watching. Night after night, the priest witnessed signs of the macabre, fleeting shapes, whispered voices, and objects displaced as if by unseen hands. Each confession reinforced the tragic reality that Florence was a city where execution, torture, and betrayal were never fully hidden, only obscured by beauty and faith. Lorenzo's body and mind weakened under the relentless exposure to these horrors, yet he remained steadfast, compelled by duty and the haunting understanding that he was the only vessel for these truths. The city's fog seemed to carry the voices of the vanished, the condemned, and the cursed, layering a sense of dread over every step he took. Tales of brutal killings, poisoned intentions, and tragic betrayals were no longer isolated. They were interconnected, creating a web of bloodshed that spread through families, clergy, and citizens alike. Lorenzo began to map the connections, each confession revealing the extent of human cruelty and the depth of the cursed that flourished unnoticed. Victims' cries, once faint in his imagination, became vivid, blending with visions of execution and torture that invaded his waking and sleeping hours alike. The priest's perception of Florence shifted, the city itself appearing alive with macabre intent, haunted by tragedies that refused to be forgotten. Every alley seemed to echo with vanished voices, every shadow a reminder of the bloodshed that had been carried out in secret. The cumulative horror created an almost palpable weight, the tragic, cursed, and brutal intersecting with every step he took, leaving him in a state of constant vigilance and despair. The confessional, once a place of sacred absolution, had transformed into a chamber of relentless torment, linking each confession into an unbroken chain of cursed revelations. Father Lorenzo's existence became inseparable from the vanished, the poisoned, and the condemned, his every thought haunted by the macabre and brutal truths he had absorbed. Florence's beauty was overshadowed by the tragic and cursed history he uncovered, a city where murder, bloodshed, and vanished innocence were woven into the very fabric of its streets. Leaving the priest to bear witness in isolation, a lone figure trapped within a web of horror that would test the limits of his faith and sanity. The culmination of Florence's hidden horrors reached its apex one fateful night, when Father Lorenzo discovered a confessional that held the most macabre and cursed revelation of his life. A penitent, trembling and pale, recounted a tale of brutal murders orchestrated within the noble houses, victims vanished without trace, and poisoned intentions concealed behind ceremonial devotion. Each word hung heavy in the air, as though the confessional itself absorbed the weight of bloodshed and tragedy, amplifying the terror in Lorenzo's mind. Shadows appeared to move with unnatural purpose, echoing the horror of the tales and imbuing the church with an oppressive sense of the cursed. Execution, torture, and murder were no longer abstract concepts but vivid events that painted themselves across the priest's consciousness, leaving him both witness and unwilling participant. He felt the presence of the condemned, their spirits, entwined with the tragic reality of Florence, their cries and whispers merging with the shadows that haunted every corridor. The macabre sequence of events unfolded further as evidence of cult activity emerged. Symbols etched in hidden chambers and secret rooms, each a testament to vanished innocence and the poisoned hearts behind the acts. Lorenzo's mind raced, trying to comprehend the scale of bloodshed, betrayal, and execution that had been meticulously concealed for decades. The cursed nature of these revelations seemed to seep into the walls themselves, the air thick with tragedy and the oppressive weight of brutal human actions. Every confession he had absorbed over the years converged into this moment, forming a tapestry of horror that left him teetering on the edge of sanity. The city outside remained unaware, its beauty and art masking the brutal truths lurking beneath, while Lorenzo alone bore the burden of human depravity exposed in its purest, most tragic form. Night after night, the confessions had prepared him for this culmination, yet the magnitude of the cursed, the vanished, and the brutal exceeded even his most harrowing expectations. The penitent described rituals of execution and torture that were performed in the shadows of Florence, detailing the vanished victims and the poisoned intentions that had guided each act. Lorenzo felt the cursed presence of those lost souls surrounding him, their anguish and tragedy pressing upon his body and mind, leaving him physically weak and spiritually tormented. Bloodshed, once a distant concept within the confessions, became immediate and tangible, a haunting force that imprinted itself upon every step the priest took. The city's fog seemed to carry these horrors beyond the church walls, whispering tales of vanished innocence and brutal betrayal to every street and alley. Lorenzo's hands shook as he grasped the confessional's edge, understanding that the sacred duty of hearing confessions had led him directly into the heart of Florence's cursed and macabre history. Every detail of execution, murder, and tragic cruelty was revealed with unrelenting clarity, a web of poison, bloodshed, and vanished victims that left no corner untouched. The priest realized that he was entwined with these horrors, inseparable from the macabre and cursed truths, bearing witness to events that defied human comprehension. The climax of revelation pressed upon him like a tangible weight, leaving him haunted, condemned, and forever marked by the brutal and tragic realities of Florence. The penitent's final revelation shattered all semblance of normalcy for Father Lorenzo, exposing a network of cursed acts, vanished victims, and poisoned hearts that stretched across Florence. Each detail was more brutal than the last, recounting executions carried out in secret, ritualistic torture, and bloodshed disguised beneath devotion. The priest felt the weight of every confession he had ever heard converge upon him, a macabre symphony of tragedy, horror, and cursed intent that left his body trembling and his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Shadows twisted in the candlelight, echoing the anguish of the condemned and the brutality of the vanished, as if the church itself had become a vessel for the macabre forces Lorenzo had unwittingly absorbed. Execution, torture, and murder were no longer stories. They were living presences pressing upon him with relentless force, each revelation more tragic and cursed than the last. The city beyond the confessional remained oblivious, its streets cloaked in art and beauty, yet beneath the surface the brutal and macabre network thrived, leaving the priest as the sole witness to its horrifying expanse. Cult symbols, once obscured in hidden chambers, revealed a pattern of poisoned intentions and vanished innocence, a tapestry of bloodshed meticulously orchestrated over decades. Lorenzo's hands shook as he traced the connections, understanding that the tragic events he had uncovered were part of a larger cursed reality, one that entwined murder, torture, and the macabre with the very fabric of Florence. The shadows in the church seemed to whisper, recounting the horrors of vanished victims, the cries of the condemned, and the brutality of execution carried out in secrecy. Every confession he had absorbed became a thread in this overwhelming tapestry, leaving him haunted and condemned, unable to escape the tragic and cursed truth that now defined his existence. Bloodshed seemed to seep from the walls, the macabre imprints of tortured souls pressing upon him relentlessly, while the vanished and the brutal appeared to watch from every corner. The priest realized that his duty had made him inseparable from the horrors he documented, a vessel for cursed, tragic, and brutal truths that no one else could endure. Night after night, he felt the presence of vanished innocents and poisoned hearts surrounding him, their agony interwoven with the fabric of the city, and the weight of their stories became almost unbearable. The culmination of these revelations left Lorenzo physically weakened, yet spiritually bound to the cursed network of Florence, a man condemned to bear witness to the macabre and brutal realities that others had ignored. Execution, bloodshed, and tragedy had become his companions, inseparable from his identity, while every confession he absorbed deepened the haunting, tragic, and cursed nature of his existence. Florence itself seemed alive with these horrors, shadows and whispers moving through the streets in tandem with the priest's burden, reminding him that nothing could be forgotten, no victim left unremembered. The macabre, the cursed, and the brutal were now inseparable from both the city and the priest, and Father Lorenzo de Rossi understood with chilling clarity that his life had become a reflection of the tragic and horrifying truths he had uncovered. Each revelation, each vanished victim, each poisoned intention reinforced the grim reality. He was both witness and prisoner of Florence's darkest heart, forever entwined with bloodshed, torture, and the cursed macabre that defined the city's secret history. After the horrifying revelations, Father Lorenzo found no solace, only the weight of vanished innocence and cursed truths pressing relentlessly upon his mind. Florence's streets, once vibrant, now seemed drenched in the macabre shadows of bloodshed and betrayal, each corner a reminder of the brutal acts concealed behind the city's facade. The priest wandered through the alleys, haunted by the cries of victims whose murders had gone unnoticed, their tragic stories woven into the cursed fabric of the city. Execution and torture became daily mental companions, each confession a reminder of the poisoned hearts and vanished innocence that had shaped his reality. Even within the church, the sacred space felt tainted, shadows twisting unnaturally in candlelight, as if the macabre and cursed events he had absorbed were now embedded in every stone. Lorenzo's body weakened from sleepless nights and spiritual torment, yet he could not abandon his duty, condemned to carry the stories of the brutal, tragic, and forgotten. Citizens whispered of the haunted priest, the man who knew too much, who bore witness to bloodshed that others dared not confront. Families avoided his gaze, aware that his presence carried the echoes of vanished victims and poisoned intentions, while the clergy, fearful of the cursed weight he carried, maintained a respectful distance. The priest felt the city itself reacting, Florence alive with the ghosts of execution, murder, and betrayal, as if the vanished innocents demanded acknowledgement from the living. Every confession he had heard replayed in his mind, creating a continuous loop of tragedy and horror, blending the cursed with the macabre, the brutal with the unseen. The aftermath of such revelations was not merely psychological. It transformed the priest's daily life, isolating him from normal human interaction, leaving him entwined with the tragic and cursed narratives he had absorbed. Shadows in the street seemed to whisper of vanished innocence, of bloodshed and brutal betrayal, while the fog carried the macabre essence of Florence's hidden crimes. Lorenzo became a living repository of the city's darkest truths, unable to separate himself from the execution, torture, and murder that had defined his confessional years. The cursed nature of his existence intensified, leaving him haunted by visions of victims long forgotten and cults long vanished, whose poisoned intentions had orchestrated tragedy and secrecy. Night after night he endured the relentless weight of these horrors, each story blending with the next, creating an unbroken chain of bloodshed and macabre cruelty. The priest's mind wrestled with understanding how Florence, a city of art and devotion, could conceal such brutal and cursed acts, each confession layering upon the last in an endless cycle of tragedy. Vanished innocence and poisoned hearts seemed to follow him everywhere, their stories intertwined with his consciousness, leaving him unable to experience peace or absolution. The city's beauty could not mask the brutal reality, nor could faith alone shield him from the cursed knowledge he carried. Execution, murder, and the tragic weight of bloodshed formed an inseparable bond with the priest's identity, cementing his role as witness, victim, and reluctant keeper of Florence's macabre history. Each moment, each shadow, reinforced the cursed and brutal truths that had become his life, leaving Father Lorenzo de Rossi haunted, condemned, and irrevocably entwined with the vanished, the tragic, and the cursed. The days following the climax left Florence in a tension that could be felt in every shadowed alley and fog-laden street. While Father Lorenzo carried the cumulative weight of vanished innocence, poisoned intentions, and brutal confessions, each tale of execution and bloodshed replayed incessantly in his mind, the macabre reality refusing to loosen its grip on his thoughts. Even the church, a sanctuary of faith, seemed tainted, the walls echoing with whispers of cursed deeds, vanished victims, and tortured souls that lingered in the dim candlelight. Citizens, aware of the priest's burden, treated him with a mixture of fear and reverence, knowing he carried the tragic and brutal truths they could not face themselves. Lorenzo's existence became a solitary one, haunted day and night by the relentless reminders of Florence's cursed history, each confession threading together stories of murder, betrayal, and the macabre in ways that defied comprehension. Shadows clung to him, their movement almost sentient, a reflection of the cursed events that had defined his life and his city. Execution, torture, and bloodshed became inseparable from his perception of reality, the vanished innocence and tragic outcomes forming a web that held him captive, both physically and spiritually. The priest's mind replayed the horrors repeatedly, each iteration deepening the scar left by the macabre and brutal events, leaving him haunted and condemned by knowledge that could never be erased. Florence itself seemed to breathe in the tragedy, the fog carrying whispers of vanished victims and poisoned intentions that permeated every street, every chapel, every hidden corner. Lorenzo felt the cursed presence of those lost souls pressing upon him, their stories forming an unbroken chain of macabre events that bound him to the tragic history of his city. The confessions had transformed him into a vessel for the brutal and the cursed, a man who could never separate himself from the execution, murder, and bloodshed he had witnessed. Each day the priest moved through Florence with vigilance, aware that the city was alive with the echoes of the vanished, the tortured, and the macabre, shadows following him like persistent reminders of the cursed realities. The tragic weight of these revelations manifested in physical exhaustion and spiritual torment, yet he remained bound to his sacred duty, compelled to witness and remember the stories of the condemned and the brutal. Families whispered of the haunted priest, a man who bore the cursed knowledge of vanished innocence and poisoned hearts, a tragic figure whose presence reminded all that Florence's beauty concealed the darkest truths. Every alley, every chapel, every stone carried the imprint of bloodshed, betrayal, and vanished victims, and Lorenzo walked through it all as both observer and unwilling participant. The cumulative horror of these confessions left him isolated, unable to find peace, the macabre realities entwining with every thought, every heartbeat, and every step he took. Father Lorenzo de Rossi, condemned and haunted, became inseparable from the cursed, the brutal, and the tragic, living as a testament to Florence's dark undercurrent, the city's vanished innocence, and the relentless presence of bloodshed that could never be forgotten. Even as the aftermath settled, a lingering aura of the unexplained pervaded Florence, surrounding Father Lorenzo with whispers of cursed secrets and vanished innocence. The priest could feel the city itself alive with macabre intent, shadows shifting unnaturally, and voices echoing from empty corridors. Strange occurrences multiplied. Objects moved without cause, faint cries seemed to emanate from the walls, and the fog carried whispers of bloodshed that had never been officially recorded. Lorenzo began questioning the boundaries of reality, unsure whether the cursed, the tragic, and the brutal were solely human, or if the city had absorbed their essence, animating Florence itself with the weight of murder and torture. Cults long vanished left traces of their rituals, their symbols etched in hidden chambers, as if the cursed events refused to be forgotten. Execution, poison, and betrayal seemed to manifest inexplicably, leaving the priest haunted by phenomena that defied logic. Villagers avoided certain streets at night, claiming to hear anguished cries of victims long vanished, and Lorenzo could not dismiss the possibility that their fears were rooted in truth. Shadows of the condemned appeared in fleeting glimpses, their tragic forms trapped between worlds, their bloodshed a persistent echo of the city's dark history. The priest's nights were tormented by visions of macabre scenes he had not witnessed directly, yet whose details matched confessions he had once heard, blurring the lines between reality and spectral intervention. Florence's fog seemed thicker, almost sentient, concealing vanished innocents and poisoned hearts, hiding brutal acts that had been committed in secrecy. Lorenzo recorded the patterns meticulously, each account of execution, murder, or tortured soul weaving together into a tapestry of cursed influence that suggested forces beyond human comprehension. He felt the weight of the tragic converge with the supernatural, a haunting synergy between human cruelty and inexplicable phenomena. Candles flickered of their own accord, faint voices whispered names of victims whose deaths remained unsolved, and every corner of the city seemed saturated with macabre energy. Lorenzo could not sleep, each night blending with the last as visions of the brutal and cursed replayed endlessly, leaving him unsure whether he was witnessing ghosts or the lingering effects of executed vanished innocence. The cursed histories intertwined with science-defying events, creating a reality where execution, bloodshed, and macabre rituals persisted beyond reason. The priest confessional became a focal point for these mysteries, drawing in tragic tales of vanished victims and cursed acts that seemed to ripple through time. Florence itself became a labyrinth of haunted memory, every alley a potential echo of the brutal, the cursed, and the tragic. Lorenzo began recording these anomalies, fearful that without documentation, the city's vanished, poisoned, and executed souls would be forgotten, leaving only the cursed shadows behind. Even the clergy hesitated to enter certain sections of the church, sensing the persistent macabre energy and the haunted residue of vanished innocence. Father Lorenzo de Rossi existed in a state of perpetual vigilance, aware that the cursed, the brutal, and the tragic could manifest without warning, and that Florence's dark secrets were far from resolved. Execution, torture, bloodshed, and vanished innocence were no longer merely historical. They persisted as living spectral forces, entwining with the priest and the city in ways that defied understanding. The cursed elements of Florence continued to defy understanding, leaving Father Lorenzo teetering between reality and nightmare. Shadows shifted with unnatural purpose, and whispers of vanished innocence echoed through alleys long abandoned, as if the city itself remembered the brutal and macabre acts committed within its walls. Execution, torture, and bloodshed seemed to persist beyond their mortal timeline, traces of the cursed and the tragic bleeding into the present. Lorenzo observed symbols etched in hidden chambers, remnants of cults long vanished, their poisoned intentions leaving an indelible mark on the haunted city. Citizens whispered of spectral figures, fleeting visions of victims whose cries were never heard, and Lorenzo could feel their presence pressing upon his mind and soul. Each night brought new anomalies. Candles flickered without cause, objects moved in ways that defied logic, and distant echoes of bloodshed and brutal betrayal reverberated through the streets. The priest's confessional became a nexus for these inexplicable events, amplifying the cursed and macabre, the tragic and brutal, until Lorenzo felt inseparable from the horrors themselves. Bloodshed and vanished innocence seemed to manifest as tangible entities, blending history with spectral intrusion, a convergence of the cursed and the real. Execution and torture, once firmly in the realm of human cruelty, now appeared as persistent, almost living forces, their weight pressing relentlessly upon Lorenzo's mind. He began to record the events meticulously, aware that the haunted and cursed realities of Florence could easily be lost to time, yet fearing that documentation alone could not protect him from the macabre influence surrounding him. The priest's dreams were filled with vivid images of murdered victims, brutal betrayals, and tragic outcomes that replayed endlessly, blurring the line between confession and vision. The fog that blanketed the city seemed alive, carrying whispers of cursed acts, vanished innocence, and bloodshed that had never been acknowledged. Even within the church, shadows moved independently, and fleeting figures appeared to reenact scenes of execution and torture, their tragic presence unrelenting. Lorenzo became increasingly aware that Florence itself had become an extension of the cursed, a city where macabre forces intertwined with human cruelty to create a persistent, spectral reality. The priest's isolation deepened as he recognized that the tragic and brutal were no longer confined to mortal events. They had transformed into an enduring haunted presence that would not be forgotten. Each confession, each vanished victim, and each cursed act was now interwoven with the living city, leaving Lorenzo to navigate a labyrinth of bloodshed, torture, and poisoned intentions. The cumulative effect of these mysteries rendered him both witness and vessel, inseparable from the macabre and tragic truths that permeated every corner of Florence. Execution, cruelty, and vanished innocence became constants in his perception, and he could sense the cursed energy lingering in the air, moving through walls, streets, and chapels. a reminder that Florence's dark history was never truly at rest. Father Lorenzo di Rossi, haunted, condemned, and irrevocably tied to the brutal and cursed, understood that some secrets of the city would never be solved, and that the tragic, the macabre, and the bloodshed would endure as long as Florence itself stood. Father Lorenzo's final days were marked by a haunting realization. The cursed, the brutal, and the tragic would never release him. The weight of vanished innocence, bloodshed, and poisoned intentions pressed relentlessly upon his mind. Each memory of execution and torture, a macabre reminder of the city's hidden horrors. Florence's fog-laden streets seemed to mirror his inner turmoil, shadows twisting in ways that reflected the vanished, the cursed, and the brutal acts he had witnessed. Even the church, once a sanctuary of faith, now seemed imbued with the tragic echoes of tortured souls and macabre rituals, the confessions he had absorbed leaving indelible imprints upon its walls. The priest walked in isolation, haunted by whispers of the condemned and visions of vanished victims, their tragic presence inseparable from the city's own dark heart. Execution, murder, and bloodshed were no longer distant realities. They had become living forces entwined with his very being, leaving him a vessel for Florence's cursed truths. Citizens recognized the haunted figure, sensing the macabre and brutal weight he carried, and treated him with awe and fear. Lorenzo's nights were filled with visions of poisoned hearts, vanished innocence, and cults long vanished whose rituals continued to echo in spectral form, reminding him that the cursed and the tragic were eternal. The priest could not sleep. The weight of the bloodshed and torture pressed upon his soul, a relentless force that reminded him of Florence's hidden darkness. Every shadow seemed to carry whispers of execution, every fog-laden street a testament to vanished victims whose cries were never silenced. The confessional, once a place of absolution, had transformed into a crucible of horror, amplifying the macabre and cursed, leaving Lorenzo both witness and prisoner. Each confession had added another layer of tragedy and brutality, creating a tapestry of cursed events woven into the city's very foundation. The priest understood that he could never separate himself from these horrors, and that Florence's tragic, brutal, and macabre past had irrevocably claimed him. Bloodshed and vanished innocence were no longer historical events. They had become part of the living, breathing reality that Lorenzo inhabited, a constant reminder that the cursed cannot be escaped. Shadows of the condemned and the tortured seemed to follow him, their tragic forms blending with the fog and stone, a haunting presence that would endure beyond his lifetime. Execution, poisoned intentions, and betrayal were ever present, echoing in his footsteps, his thoughts, and the spaces he occupied. Florence, beautiful yet haunted, carried the weight of its history, the vanished, and the brutal acts that had been concealed behind art and devotion. Father Lorenzo di Rossi became inseparable from this tragic reality, a man condemned to bear witness to the macabre, cursed, and blood-soaked history of his city. Each day was a repetition of the horrors he had endured, every confession, every shadow, and every whispered story reinforcing the relentless nature of the brutal and the tragic. In his final reflections, the priest realized that his life had been irrevocably entwined with Florence's darkest truths, and that the vanished, the cursed, and the bloodshed would continue to haunt the city and himself long after he was gone. The final realization for Father Lorenzo was unavoidable. He would remain eternally entwined with Florence's cursed and macabre history, a living testament to vanished innocence, poisoned intentions, and brutal bloodshed. Each alley, every stone, and the fog-laden streets carried the tragic echoes of execution, murder, and torture, embedding themselves into the very essence of the city and the priest himself. Lorenzo could no longer distinguish between the living and the spectral, as the vanished and the condemned seemed to merge with reality, their cries, their anguish, and their stories an inseparable part of his consciousness. The confessional, once a place of solace, had transformed into a chamber of relentless horror, amplifying the cursed and brutal truths that he bore alone. Shadows followed him through the church and the streets, macabre reminders of the vanished victims and the bloodshed that had shaped Florence for centuries. Execution, poison, and betrayal were omnipresent, their weight pressing upon him with every step, a constant reminder that the tragic and cursed are never forgotten. The priest wandered through the city, haunted day and night, unable to find respite from the relentless presence of the brutal and macabre. each confession he had ever heard replaying endlessly in his mind. Cults long vanished, whose rituals had inflicted unimaginable horror, seemed to leave lingering traces, spectral imprints that whispered of tragedy and cursed intent. Florence itself appeared alive with memories of bloodshed, vanished innocence, and poisoned hearts, the city's beauty now intertwined with a dark and haunting legacy. Lorenzo's eyes reflected the weight of every brutal act, every macabre ritual, and every tragic outcome he had witnessed, leaving him physically and spiritually marked, a man condemned to eternal vigilance. The citizens, aware of the haunted figure he had become, treated him with fear and reverence, recognizing that his very existence carried the burden of the cursed, the brutal, and the tragic. Night after night, he walked the fog-laden streets, tracing the echoes of vanished victims and execution, their macabre presence a persistent reminder of the bloodshed and tragedy that had never been absolved. The priest's reflection on the cursed and macabre events revealed a city that could never forget its brutal history, a place where vanished innocence and poisoned intentions had left indelible scars upon every alley and stone. Lorenzo understood that his life, forever intertwined with Florence's darkest truths, could not return to normalcy. The tragic, the brutal, and the cursed had claimed him entirely. Each shadow, each whisper, each fleeting vision of the condemned reinforced the unending presence of bloodshed, execution, and torture, leaving the priest a solitary witness to horrors that no one else could endure. Father Lorenzo de Rossi's final awareness was chilling yet clear. He was inseparable from the cursed, the macabre, and the tragic, bound eternally to the vanished and the brutal acts that had defined Florence's hidden history. The city's fog, shadows, and whispers carried forward the legacy of the poisoned, the blood-soaked, and the executed, ensuring that the tragic and cursed would never fade from memory. His life became a living monument to the vanished innocence, the brutal executions, and the cursed events that had once been whispered only in secret. Florence and its haunted priest, forever entwined, bore witness to a history of bloodshed, betrayal, and macabre tragedy, a legacy from which neither would ever be freed.